It seems like we're ready to go. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Mia Wasserman, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer of the Internatus Business Club of New Jersey, also commonly referred to as IBC&J. And I'm also a junior at Bergen County Academies in Hackensack, New Jersey. So on the behalf of our partners and other affiliates, I'd like to welcome everyone here today to our business news and editing event with Dan Kraut, who is a top team editor at Bloomberg. However, a couple of things before we start here. If you have any questions throughout the duration of the event, please wait until the end of the session when we will have our audience Q&A session. Also, for those who might be tuning into the online recorded version, the Internatus Business Club, or IBC, is a national non-for-profit collection of business clubs consisting of emerging student leaders with the common goal of providing value to society. IBC members have access to selective networking events, workshops, and quarterly business forums, as well as internships at select partners across the country and community initiatives. For more information, feel free to check out internatus.org. And so without further ado, let me allow Mr. Kraut to introduce himself and to tell us more about Bloomberg.
Thanks. You guys can call me Dan, by the way. And also, if it works better for you guys, I'm open to questions before finishing the whole thing, but I don't want to disrupt that. If whatever works for you guys. Anyway, you can also let me know if there are different direction I should be going in. I work at Bloomberg News. My job is top editor, which doesn't tell you a whole lot. I don't know how many of you guys know what the Bloomberg terminal is. You do, good. Okay.
A few of us are certified.
Excellent. So basically, we started out for bond traders and have sort of expanded our reach to all sorts of Wall Street professionals. So you get all sorts of financial data. With that, you get the news. Now, excuse me, you can go to Bloomberg.com or whatever and get, well, there's just a little bit of free content. Now there's a paywall, but that's like a $35 a month paywall to get the online content. To get the full suite with all the data, we're talking a couple $1,000s a month. So it's a sort of premium product, which from a financial model point of view is a good place to be these days, having been at newsprint outlets that struggle to adapt. Anyway, the top page is what most people see when they log on and look for news. There are 3 different top pages. The sort of default top, especially if you're working here, is the Americas. So it's on this time zone. So it's sort of geared to people, all the way down to Brazil and Chile and up to Canada. There's top Asia, which would include, Australia, New Zealand, and sort of to Central Europe. And there's Europe, which also includes, the Middle East and Africa. My day starts around 5:20. I take over responsibility for the top Americas page at 6. So I have to be ready. I have to know what's going on. I used to start closer to 6, and I would just be bombarded by, everything I'm supposed to do is the most important thing. And I was like, it was too much to get bombarded with all that at 6. So just started coming in earlier, which is helpful though. Of course, sometimes what happens is now I get bombarded at 5:20. There's also a couple sub menus like top NYC, which is New York centric news, top Gen, which is general news. Now the top page will include government stuff, some culture type stories, not a huge amount, but if it's big enough or interesting, the Grammys or something, we'll love a story on that. Some local government stuff. Top Gen would be all of that stuff and very little of the finance. There's top NYC, and also top sports. We subscribe to, and this is relatively new, we subscribe to like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and they get through our feed. So it appears on the sort of famous Bloomberg black and orange type or whatever. So if you go to top sports, we picked some sports stories from those providers. And, that's an offering that some of our readers want. So the central part of my job is picking the stories that readers say. We have, I think it's 39 stories, maybe 37. There's the top 4 stories up top, and they're locked in there. Is the 4 most important stories. And then there's a carousel, maybe 11 lines. 11. It is 11 lines below. So those stories 5 through 15 sit there, and then it all shifts, and you get a second, link of the carousel of 11 stories, and then a third. The one that's on the front page is programmed to show more frequently, and then the third page at least frequently. So those are the stories that are in rotation once. The top 4, which are just sort of locked in there, then the bottom 33 are on the carousel, as we call it. We try to get a mix of stuff. What we offer depends on the day, at the time of the day, and of course what's breaking. More than almost anyone, the value proposition is this just in news. It's sort of like pizza or coffee or whatever. Like, it can get old pretty quickly. Say like New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, which are respected in finance and beyond, they'll have their top stories, and they can stay there all day. Our readers tend to want something new more quickly. So when I'm logging on at 6 or taking the page at 6, the audience is a lot of people like me who probably went to sleep at 9 or 10 the night before. So anything that happened overnight in Asia, and by Asia I mean down to Australia or whatever, the Pacific, or that morning in Europe, Zurich, London, Paris, the Middle East. People are seeing that for the first time, so we want to feature that prominently. And then I don't know how much you guys know about like the stock trading day starts at 9:30. Companies that are going to announce news have to announce either before or after trading. You don't sort of want the volatility of releasing that information while the price is fluctuating. So at like 7:00, there'll be a lot of companies will put out press releases, I don't know if you guys know what 8K is. It's if you're a publicly listed company, you have to file a 10K, which is an annual report, a 10Q, which is a quarterly report, and then interim reports, which sort of update if there's a substantial change since the last quarter. You got to let the investor community know, so people aren't making their decisions in the dark. We sort through all that, and sometimes it's obvious what's important. Sometimes we might be able to find something that our readers wouldn't know about. Earnings are a classic thing that comes out. We pump out a bunch of earnings stories. So picking the stories is not that hard once you know what the readers want. There's also a big element of coordination involved. An example, I don't know if it was last week or 2 weeks, probably 2 weeks ago now, when the Omicron variant was detected in South Africa. We have well over 1,000 reporters, and we produce, I believe it's a couple thousand news items a day. Not all of them are intended to be on the top page. We'll have stories like corn is little changed. If your life is the corn market, you want to know why there's no change. There's a lot of people that don't care, or only care if there's some dramatic change. In the case of the variant, it touched a lot of people's roles. Like, it's a health story. It affects, the classic things, the epidemiology, the life outcomes. All sorts of stocks were moving. Travel stocks like airlines and cruise ships were all sinking. The South African market, South African currency, bonds, that stuff is suddenly very high interest, things that aren't normally at the forefront of people's minds. Vaccine makers were doing well. So we have to sort this all out. And what I can't do is have like 12 straight stories all about little angles of the variant. So that's sort of where they get involved coordinating, people in South Africa, people in London, people in New York, people in Washington, and being like, all right, what are our main items going to be? Who's working on them? And then also, this has changed drastically since I started the business in the 90s. But even the last few years, it's much easier to put links to other stories in what we call the main bar or the key sidebars. So there's really quite a bit of coordination involved there. 9:30, stocks start trading on U.S. markets. So we're really busy, I would say, 6 till about 10:30. There's often a bit of an equilibrium in those middle hours until stock trading closes at 4. There's other sources of news, keep in mind, though. The government, we tend to focus on the government most when it relates to money. So anything about the budget, anything about the fiscal cliff, taxes, we take very seriously. And of course, monetary policy, central banks, things like that. Also, there'll be like financial conferences where CEOs will be talking at various events, and we cover that in real time. We send out headlines, which was sort of novel when we first started doing it. It would almost be like I'd be taking the notes on my screen, just like sort of like Twitter, but before Twitter. I sent it at a time and send it out. And our customers can set up their terminals to be like, I want news about natural gas. I want news about investment banks or bonds, German bonds, or the Japanese JGBs, Japan government bonds. And we code everything we send so it hits the people that for whom it's most valuable. And we've actually moved more in the last few years toward alerts. It used to be, our traders came in Monday morning, they worked till Friday afternoon, they went home, and they'd log on the next morning. But everyone's got their devices. You guys probably don't know a world without these things. But it wasn't that long ago where they were sort of rare and you'd only use it for limited things. Now, a lot of people want to get their news and alerts. So we're also picking stories to designate as urgent or urgent Asia, hot. There's all sorts of different standards. And then people can subscribe to different ways. They can certainly get a mobile alert, they can get a talking alert, they can set an alarm sound. So that's a big part of the job as well. Also, we have what they call it, key event alerts. So like there's the whole Biden, the Build Back Better plan, which has been dragging on, it's constantly evolving, and some things are in, some things are out. You can subscribe so that every time a story hits on that topic, you get an alert. We have to code them to make sure they go there. Because the job is way less than it used to be about just like, here's our 37 stories, take it from there. There's much more specialization. Excuse me, I'm just gonna have a swallow of water. All right. Me asked me to talk a little about how I got in the business, which was sort of a roundabout way. I knew about finance some when I was your guys' age. I did not go to college, really with much of a plan at all for what I was going to do after. But toward the end, decided I would pursue journalism, which I'm glad I did. Anyway, I started like a lot of people in local journalism. You know, at first it was in Maryland. I covered agriculture, which answers the question of how I became a vegetarian. And local government, you know, the Chesapeake Bay and oystermen and lobstermen, things like that. Came back to New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. Oh, there's a question too. One thing I liked, so I majored in sociology at college, small group sociology, because you could also study sociology like cultures and nations and religion and things like that. Small group dynamics. And I like the sort of participant observation and the telling stories and seeing where people get their identity. And when I began as a reporter, you know, I gravitated more toward that writing touch and you know, having my vision. And I was writing about people. My first, I got a summer internship for the Star Ledger in the Middlesex County Bureau in Woodbridge. Then started working at the Herald News in Passaic, which at the time was an independent competitor to the Record. And that was great. Sort of a crazy place, you know, lots of police corruption. And actually, I got my first exposure to insurance that way because there were, you know, people would smash up. I get 4 passengers, you get 4 passengers, smash up the cars on the corner. Everyone goes to the doctor with some sort of small tissue injury, or at least claiming one. And then the money starts pouring into everyone. So I did that, went to the Record, which is a bigger paper. One thing you guys should know, and this partly explains my shift to business journalism, is that sort of local news is not very lucrative. And most journalism is not very lucrative. That stuff is even farther from lucrative. It was a lot of fun. It was a great place to be in my 20s. The person who sat across from me introduced me to my wife. So all that's great. Tough to live there as an adult on the sort of salaries you get there, which was fine because I was an adult, but I eventually slowly became one. And so went to the Bergen Record, which you guys probably, hopefully all know. Worked as a reporter there. I went briefly to a .com right at the peak of, you know, the bubble. It's a place called appbnews.com. And I believe it was my first Friday there. Oh, the story involves a bad word. I better be careful. But some guy came around taking our order, what we wanted for lunch. Or it was like, what pizza? It's like, do you want, what topping do you want? And how many slices do you want? I told him, I thought that was great. This guy, Hans, who sat next to me, he's like, wait, did they just ask you how much pizza you want? And I was like, yeah. He's like, oh my God. He's like, we are so screwed. He didn't say screwed. He's like, we are so screwed. I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, they've never asked that before. They would just bring out lunch for everyone. Sure enough, and I was the last person they hired. 2 weeks later, the whole thing collapsed. Happily, I went back to the Record. APB was ahead of its time. A lot of the stuff now is considered sort of on the edge. We were doing way back then, but the market wasn't ready for us. Anyway, I went back to the Record, and so I sort of got into, rekindled my interest in the stock market during the .com era, because at least for a while, it was so easy to make money. So I'd pay attention, you know, while I was covering local government or whatever. I'd be like, paying attention to stocks, which my bureau chief knew about. He eventually became the business editor. And the Record decided to sort of bulk up the business coverage. And he asked me to join him, which I did. I'd already been an editor. I worked during 9/11, covering all the victims, all sorts of things, local news. But then I went to business news there. And I was probably there about 3 years. And I knew a couple of people that went to Bloomberg. And when I went there, they had the job opening for insurance editor. There was also an opening for, what was it? Legal team report. I'd covered court houses and all. And I told the recruiter guy, I was like, hey, that could be interesting too. And the guy, I was like, I don't want to limit myself to just one opportunity if there's other ways to get in. And he said, let me tell you, he said to have someone that comes here with knowledge of insurance, not to mention any interest at all in the topic, that makes you the guy for this job. And that's actually, it applied to that opportunity in particular, but being able to seize opportunity where other people may not see it, it's like an arbitrage. It's very useful in Wall Street. It's useful everywhere, really. And it turned out insurance wound up being a very interesting place to be because AIG was at the center of the financial crisis. Buffett, like Ben Franklin, a lot of brilliant people have sort of this weird sense for insurance and managing risk. He's at Geico and he has all sorts of companies in the heart of the industry. He, of course, navigated the financial crisis more nimbly, but that was also interesting to cover. Does that cover high school, college? I guess so. I'm going to number 3. Actually, I think I kind of just answered number 3. Yeah, that covers most of them. I'll tell you one thing that's changed, of course. I started at a twice-a-week newspaper, and your deadline was twice a week. And you would just sit on the news and you'd write it all up. Try to remember the days we published. I think Tuesdays and Fridays, so Monday night and Thursday night, you'd write out all your stories. And it's tricky because stories are kind of living, breathing things. Even if you try to write it on Wednesday, by the time Thursday comes, it changed a little. So inevitably, like people in magazines, that final deadline is a busy one. And then I started being in daily journalism where everything is for the next morning. Just sort of at the end of my time at the Record, we started doing some real-time stuff we got right to the internet. I know for you guys, it's hard to imagine a world where this didn't exist. I don't know if anyone there is a sports fan, but nice. When I was at college, I played rotisserie baseball, and we would wait, because college or late, we'd wait for the truck to drive by with the newspapers because it would have all the box scores from last night's game. Now, obviously, you can get all that stuff in real time, and if you're a news provider, you have to. Not that you can't find a niche providing insight the next day, but there's a giant audience that expects real-time news. And I would say that was quite an awakening when I got to Bloomberg. We sort of aim, and now that I'm on the top team, I help enforce this, to have the first news out within 5 minutes. So if a statement heads or a regulatory filing, we send the headlines in real time. Then often it'll just be 2 paragraphs with a link to the statement. But we want it to be at least the first paragraph to be meaningful. Here's what happened and what it means and why it's important. The second graph might be like whatever. They made the disclosure in regulatory filing. And then we want to have that built out to 4 or 5 graphs, 15, maybe 10 minutes. So we're filling a screen with links at that point to stock prices or whatever, the yield curve, some sort of financial instrument. And in some cases, we can have the full story within, a couple of screens long. If we're prepared, some things, of course, are going to catch you off guard within 15 minutes of that. So the real time is highly important. One thing that the Trump era also presented some unique circumstances in that it was very unpredictable. Not only was there all the drama surrounding the president and all his team or whatever, but you never know when he would send, post something on Twitter about oil prices or whatever. And he doesn't exactly explain them all with all that context. So you get things where he'd say something and like, all of a sudden the price of oil is moving. But people are like, wait, did he mean this? 15 minutes later, he sends something else that seemingly contradicts it. Oil moves the other way. That's complicated to adapt to, especially if you don't have the luxury, and we don't have the luxury of like, let's wait an hour and sort it out. So that was definitely, that I think says more about that one administration and one president necessarily than about the industry, but it does show how when you're on hyper alert, how volatile things can be. Let me get to question 4. One piece of advice. Well, you got to enjoy what you're doing, I would say. If you find what you do rewarding, and stimulating, that's super valuable. And also, you want to be among people, a culture you feel comfortable with. My wife is a social worker, works in a hospital setting, and it's meaningful work. And she's surrounded by a community of people who sort of approach life the same way as her. The world needs, the world's a socialist, the world needs journalists, it needs all sorts of people. So there's a ton of ways to contribute, but if you find a way that feels right for you, if you're motivated, if you take ownership of what you're doing, you're much more likely to be successful on the job and really in the rest of your life. Mia, it's Mia, right? I think I'm ready for questions, or if there's other stuff you want me to touch on, I certainly can.
Okay, great. So I don't think we got any questions in the chat yet, but if any members have any, feel free to put some in now. If not, I could start with the first one, I guess. Okay, so what would you say your top 3 stories are that you've covered during your career as a reporter?
Wow. It's funny, I've opened to a lot of stories, no matter how crazy they are. I'm like, oh yeah, I've covered this one before. The 3 that I've never covered before are 9/11. And you guys weren't even born yet, right? No. That was scary. I was in Hackensack. The building's not even there anymore, but there's a giant windows, and you can see all the way across the Meadowlands to New York, and the smoke. And the real question was, is that all they have, or was that their best shot, or was that just their first shot? So that was super scary. And of course, there were numerous local angles. Some of the hijackers had lived or stayed nearby. Many of the victims, of course. And so everything was disrupted, transportation and work life. And we had tons of stories about either people who just made it out, or, people who, ran down from the 90th floor and, just made it out, or people who like left their keys at the counter and wound up being late to work. And had they been on time, they would have been killed. And then the stories about the people that weren't found. So we had day after day. I mean, our paper was so, when I mean heavy, it was like you had to read it. And we had this photo. Can you guys see my shirt? The September 11th, the flag photo. I don't know if you can see it. There it is. I didn't wear that on purpose today, but it's a cool shirt. So we had that photo, the most famous photo of the whole day. I was actually one of the first people in the world, probably one of the first 10 people in the world to see this. So for those days, we were producing such a good product. I would say the third or fourth day, the New York Times had some story on like structural decisions that were made in like building the World Trade Center, and how these like fateful decisions in the 1970s or whatever left architectural vulnerabilities, which of course was well beyond our area of expertise. And the other one was something about US nearest landing rights on Uzbeki bases or something like that. The Tajiks and the Uzbeks. And of course, the Times has people in all those worlds. We were like, when it was in Woodridge or Franklin Lakes or Clifton or whatever, we were all over. Once the story moved to Uzbekistan, it was a little tougher for us. But that was hopefully something I've never seen before. Hopefully we'll never see again. This is just a one-off event, and I was really not very much directly involved. This, you guys may have, when Jim McGreevey, our governor, sort of came out, he was involved in this scandal with like, he's married to a woman, but he had a relationship with a man who was, on the state payroll. And I was like, wow, that no one had ever seen that before. And that was it was shocking. Times are a little different now, but still, that was a unique experience. And then, of course, the financial crisis was to our readers. You can feel, when you're putting out stories that, like, we can count the hits, which of course you couldn't do 20 years ago. But you would see within minutes how many hundreds or thousands or multi-thousands of hits a story is getting. And you're like, wow, people are really hanging on this, because the cost of a lot of things is depending on the truth that's like people are looking for insider coverage. The virus is similar in a way. I mean, I'm more in the news organization, news presentation now than the actual news gathering. But there too, it's a 100-year event. There's been nothing like it in 100 years, and it touched everything. It certainly touched financial markets, more than touched. It disrupted the economies. We're still feeling it in many ways. It actually made a lot of companies more valuable. Certainly a lot of tech companies, and of course the vaccine makers. And it's it's changing the way people work and live. So that really stands out as well. And the end of that story has obviously not been written yet. So that makes it interesting too.
Okay, do we have any other members who want to ask some questions?
Yeah, I have a question. What was your favorite position that you held within the news industry?
Thank you. I would say my fondest memories go back to when I was working at the Herald News in Passaic, in my young 20s. Now, like I said, that was unsustainable. There wasn't much money, and I was working super late all the time. I mean, at Bloomberg, especially during a financial crisis, I had long hours. But we'd work, start working around 11. Totally different than now. Now, I mean, I'm at work from home now, so it's not quite as hard to be at my desk at 5:20. But back then I had a commute of only a couple miles, and I was show up at work at 10 or 11. And then we might cover a night meeting. Write up our stories 9, 10 o'clock, and go. And then we'd go out. Go out to a restaurant, a bar. Then the sports guys would be the last guys in. They'd be there when the papers started rolling off the press. So they'd come. They'd bring a stack of papers, and you'd see your stories. That was really fun. And it's amazing how many friends I have from that era. Partly it's the stage of life before I had kids. And partly just there was a lot of camaraderie and exuberance, in that era. It's a lot of freedom as well. It was a satisfying era. But after a few years, I was like, I get out of this place. Because some of the trends that have since accelerated, making print journalism less profitable, were already evident there. So there was a constant squeeze. But eventually it was clear if I was going to raise a family, I probably had to move beyond that. And you don't necessarily want to spend your whole life. Everyone else is moving on too when they're 25, 26. It's great to be a bunch of 25-year-olds when you're 25. But you can see how that could wear. It's not a great long-term plan. It's like I was with this guy once who was actually in the U.S. Navy, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but like I'll there's some numbers out there. He's like every year they take like 20,000 18 and 19-year-olds, and every year they make like, I don't know, 20 people admirals. It's like that's a lot of people. They like when you start off when you're like whatever, scrubbing down the deck and sleeping on like boards stacked on top of each other. Those are jobs for 18-year-olds. There's only so many jobs for older people, and the Herald News is sort of like that.
Okay, thank you. So we're closing in on time, so I think we're going to wrap it up here. For all of our members, more information about our next events will be provided soon via Slack. For many of you tuning in online who may be interested in becoming a member of IBC, please check out any of our national chapters at internatus.org/apply. I want to take a moment to thank all of you guys for coming and our speaker, Mr. Kraut, for taking this time out of their day to speak for us. It was very insightful, not just for me, but for all of our members, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day.